Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I just want to say thank each and every last one of you for making your way out in this inclement weather, if you will. I want to give a special shout out to the presidents of both BLSA, Mr. Devin Brown, as well as Mr. Alex Thibodeau, who couldn't be here, who's stuck in traffic, for them putting this program on. And we want to thank our special guest, Professor Lovelace and Professor Brown. We certainly would be remiss, and we thank our Dean of the Law School for being here, Austin Parrish, Dean Austin Parrish. So let's give him a round of applause. And certainly to each of you, to every faculty member, staff, and of course you, the student body, and the 1Ls, thank you so much, Carl, for your tireless work in putting this together, and everyone who was involved. We just wanted to have something. We know it's Dr. King, Martin Luther King's Day. We know it's a day on and not a day off. We certainly thought it not robbery to be here on this day and provide some context. We hear so much about the I Have a Dream speech and in its context, and it's beautiful. But we also wanted to just take a different spin on it and see it from a different perspective. So we wanted to show the speech from the beginning to the end. You'll notice also some of the 1Ls and few people here are adorned in their white shirts and denim jeans, which we'll talk about that a little later. But we're not going to belabor the time. Without further ado, we want to thank Professor Lovelace, who's given us the opportunity to give us a contextual introduction to this wonderful speech and so many different things. We have a wonderful meal that's going to be prepared for you in the back after the speech, and then we're going to have a wonderful introduction. But before we get started, I just want to provide words, a moment here to allow Dean Parrish, if he would to have some words. Let's give a round of applause for Dean Parrish.
I'm going to keep this very brief. I just think it's really important and great for us to be able to come together as a community to celebrate and honor the legacy of Dr. King and do it in a way where we can reflect on the values that he inculcated. And part of that community is to have leaders like Kevin and others in BLSA and SBA to be able to put this event together. This morning at the leadership breakfast on campus, the provost noted that perhaps we all had a moment of pause as we stepped out the doors this morning as to whether we were going to get to the event because of how bad it is out there. And so I'm glad that you all decided to take the time and make the effort to come to this important event. Can we have a round of applause for Kevin and the SBA and BLSA? So thanks for coming to this important event. You don't want to hear from me. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Lovelace. Is that correct? Or Kevin. Either way. Kevin?
Welcome. Welcome. In Jacqueline Dowd Hall's The Long Civil Rights Movement and the Political Uses of the Past, Hall declares, images of the movement appear and reappear each year on Martin Luther King Day and during Black History Month. Yet remembrance is always a form of forgetting. And the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement, distilled from history and memory, twisted by ideology and political contestation, embedded in heritage tours, museums, public rituals, textbooks, and various artifacts of mass culture, distorts and suppresses as much as it reveals. Hall here is challenging us to question the master narrative of the civil rights movement. It's one that canonizes the king, that sanitizes his legacy, that freezes him in time on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. So hopefully in our short time today, we too might challenge the master narrative of the civil rights movement and make a speech that we think is familiar, unfamiliar. If the Kennedys would have had their way, there would have been no March on Washington in 1963. Civil rights activists had come to Washington to demand a Civil Rights Act of 1963. We now know this as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was not a pep rally for the Kennedy administration. President Kennedy, the embodiment of the white moderate that Dr. King chastised in his letter from the Birmingham jail, pressed march planners not to have this march. Kennedy argued that having a march on Washington would alienate the potential allies of the civil rights movement. This was the urge of gradualism. Nonetheless, march planners decided to hold the march. But thousands of federal troops, because of President Kennedy, remained on call. Schools closed. Helicopters hovered over the march. The city even closed all of its liquor stores, thinking that African Americans would come to the city, get drunk, and riot in the streets. As one Washington newspaper put it in 1963, quote, "The general feeling is that vandals are coming to sack Rome." And let's be clear about the march's title. We say the March on Washington, but the full title was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Questions of labor and political economy were at the center of the march's theme. This march had been proposed in 1941 by A. Philip Randolph, the eminent labor leader, and the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. March demonstrators carried signs demanding full employment, demanding decent housing, and demanding freedom, a discourse that transcends rights. And even think about the movement's tactics, sit-ins, right? We're in a law school, right? These are people making constitutional claims with their bodies. The sit-in activists get this from the labor movement, the sit-ins that happened earlier in the 20th century. And even the movement's anthem, We Shall Overcome, comes from the labor movement itself. It was a labor song. And this was not King's first March on Washington in 1963. In 1957, King marched on Washington to celebrate Brown's third anniversary. In 1958, King traveled to D.C. for a youth march for integrated schools. In 1959, he again hosted a youth march for integrated schools in Washington, D.C. And as he died, he was preparing for another March on Washington as part of the Poor People's Campaign. This would culminate in May of 1968 with the Poor People's March and the Resurrection City. This was also not King's first time talking about the dream or delivering portions of this speech. In 1956, King declared, quote, "On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court of this nation rendered in simple and unequivocal terms one of the most momentous decisions ever rendered in the history of this nation. To all men of goodwill, this decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity." King's ringing endorsement of Brown in 1956 resurfaced in the opening stanzas of the 63 I Have a Dream speech. The speech's closing, "Free at last," borrows undoubtedly from a Negro spiritual. But those same words, "free at last," were heard in 1957 at Ghana's independence ceremonies that King attended. He's a global thinker, and he had traveled to Ghana at the request of Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah. And then much of the speech was preached 2 months earlier in Detroit at Cobo Hall. Right? Detroit had a coalition of civil rights activists and ministers. They were led by the Reverend C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, right? 1963. There was also great contestation between the movement's leadership. With all of the discussion of inclusion, most notably women were marginalized in the program. Just take a look at the program itself. Women like Dorothy Height, the president of the National Council of Negro Women, right, talks about being ostensibly in the movement's leadership, but the men did all the speaking. The youngest speaker during the March on Washington, John Lewis, had his speech censored. He said that in the proposed civil rights bill, There was nothing to protect peaceful demonstrators from police brutality. There was nothing in the proposed bill that would help those who did not have a sixth grade education vote. There was nothing in the bill that would help maids who made $5 a week to improve their living conditions. But the beauty of the march, we can see this in a number of ways. One of the ways is that Bayard Rustin, an openly gay African-American man, was the chief planner of the March on Washington in 1963. That King, despite rampant red baiting, despite rampant homophobia in America, decided to keep an openly gay man, right, as one of his closest lieutenants. We have to celebrate that today. The beauty of this march is that more than 200,000 people came together on a Wednesday. And they took to the global stage, right? And they talked about the fierce urgency of now, that they too were freedom dreamers. And the beauty of our celebration today is that we can use this as a moment to hear King in his own words and in his own terms. That you might read King in his speeches, right? Beyond Vietnam, The Other America, his speech on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycott, right? The Holt Street Baptist Church speech, that you might read King's Economic and Social Bill of Rights, where King declares that there should be a right to a decent job for all Americans, that there should be a minimum, a guaranteed minimum income, that there should be true universal health care, not a privatized system that we call universal health care. We use this as a moment, as an invitation to have a deeper dialogue with Dr. King, the man who said that racism wasn't simply a sectional problem, but a national problem. The man that said that the triplets of evil were racism, militarism, and materialism. The man who opposed a Vietnam War. Our task today as scholars is to tell a truer story, to challenge the master narrative, and I know that we're up to this challenge. Thank you.
In order to say that we are determined, and in order to engage in a nonviolent protest to keep this issue before the conscience of the nation,
at this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Such powerful words. We wanted to let Dr. King speak for himself. So as we just take in what we just heard, we're going to take a moment, take a small break here. We're going to have our food, and we're going to have about 10 minutes. And as you're getting your food, Professor Kevin Brown is going to come and facilitate a discussion. Things I want you to think about as you're getting your food, as you're sequencing, just understand the words that he spoke in 1963, the relevance of those words even today. Can that speech be said today, and how relevant is it is now? But not only that, where have we moved from 1963 to 2018? This is an open discussion. This is your words. We don't want you to feel compelled to think, but we want whatever you got from that. Let it speak for itself. And we wanted Dr. King to speak for itself. And without further, I certainly want us to, again, give a round of applause for Professor Lovelace and his introduction and wonderful history lesson. Thank you so much. And again, we thank, for those who didn't come to hear our initial introduction, we thank each and every last one of you for showing up in this inclement weather. And I see we have Dean Motley in the house, and we certainly appreciate your coming. So at this time, we're just going to take a small break just to grab food, but get your food, come back to your seats, because we want to have Professor Brown come and facilitate us in discussion. Thank you so much. All right, so as you guys are eating, and I know a few people are still getting their food, a few people asked me what the significance of the denim and the white shirts were. Just real quick, it was almost like the unofficial uniform of the civil rights movement. Denim became a symbol of the revolution. You may recall, well, you may not recall, but there was a point where Easter Sunday where they all wore denim, and they want to impact the economic conditions in which they lost a lot of money, and everybody wore jeans on Easter as opposed to the clothing. Denim during the 60s became the sign of revolution, in contrast to the politics of respectability, because denim and jeans were considered sharecroppers' clothing and improper. So many black and white wore in solidarity, especially for the Northerners who were going down south to help register voters, because they were not accepted as Northerners. Many of them wore the denim overalls to show that they were like them, and that was the conduit to them having the ability to be trusted. And there's a lot of history on denim, and so I just want to do it in many marches. As a kid, I grew up, we wore denim and the white shirts and locked arm in arm, the chain throughout wherever the institution. But that's just some of the quick history. And without further ado, we have Professor Brown that's going to facilitate our open discussion. And of course, he's going to talk first and give us his background. I have a great deal of respect for both Lovelace and Professor Brown. And without further ado, I just want to thank you again for being here. We're going to turn it in the hands of Professor Brown.
Thank you for that introduction. I want to thank SBA. I want to thank BLSA and also Kevin Jones for giving me this opportunity to speak, and that is to moderate this conversation. And my hope is to create a broad space here for people to actually talk. While this is the day that celebrates the birth of Martin Luther King Jr., we're actually coming up on the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And this isn't just the 50th anniversary of his assassination, but if you think about it, we're 6 months past the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Loving versus Virginia, which struck down interracial marriage statutes. And it's the 50th anniversary of 1968. That means we've got coming up the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who quite probably would have become president in 1968. And just for us here in the law school, imagine the difference if Kennedy had become president compared to Nixon, because in Nixon's first term, he appointed 4 justices to the Supreme Court. So imagine if we had replaced Chief Justice Warren Burger, William Rehnquist, Lewis Powell, and Harry Blackmun, the early Harry Blackmun, with 4 justices to the Supreme Court, appointed by one of the most liberal presidents we would have ever had. Indeed, this is the 50th anniversary of the 1968 election, where George Wallace won 5 southern states and 13.5% of the popular vote. The ardent segregationists who stood in the way of desegregation of the University of Alabama and proclaimed segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. This is the 50th anniversary of when Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for president. And Lyndon Johnson was the president who passed more major civil rights legislation and legislation for poor people than any president in our own history. We know about the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Fair Housing Rights Act of 68, but also the Education, Elementary, and Secondary Act of 65, which doubled federal funding to public schools. Johnson passed legislation to create Medicare, created Medicaid, created Head Start food stamps and work study. He passed the most comprehensive federal gun control act in the history of the country. This is also the 50th anniversary of when a particular act of the Johnson administration took effect, and that was the Immigration Act of 1965. It took effect on January 1, 1968. Before that act, for 40 years before that act, American immigration policy had pretty much excluded everyone from the rest of the world except for Northern and Western Europe, people like those from Norway. So we had had very little immigration, almost no immigration from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, indeed also from Southern and Eastern Europe. So there's a tremendous amount to think about as we reflect here. And when Kevin asked me to do this, I told him, I said, look, okay, I've done a lot of Martin Luther King Jr. speeches, but I've never done one in the law school, so I have to take some time and talk. And I thought what I'd do is do a perspective from 1968 the way I see it. At that point, America was 99.4% black or white. So it really was a black-white nation. Now, in order to really situate these comments, I got to tell you a little about myself. But I'm not doing it just to tell you about myself. I'm also trying to do it to tell you about what life would have been like for the most privileged blacks of the day. Because you see, both of my parents were public school teachers. Both of them had 2 degrees from Bloomington down here. My father was head of the math department at Indianapolis Crispus Attucks High School, the all-black high school. Indeed, my dad had been valedictorian and president of his senior class. And back in those days, to be black, if you were going to be a professional, you were going to be a teacher. And the highest level of teacher, of course, was a teacher in high school. And your best teachers were your teachers in your hardest subject, math clearly being one of them. So I had a very privileged upbringing, and both of my brothers did fairly well, too. My younger brother graduated from Columbia Law School. He became the youngest person ever elected to statewide office in the history of the state of Indiana. My older brother graduated and got his MBA from Kelly down here after dropping out of this law school after the first week. He went on, got his PhD, and he's a clinical associate professor at the Kelly School of Business up in Indianapolis. And up through 1968, actually in 1968, my family had moved. Up through that time, up to 1966, I had gone to school in de jure segregated schools in Indianapolis. all black schools. And when I say all black, I mean all black. All the teachers were black, all the students were black, all the administrators were black, all the janitors were black. Our neighborhood was all black, so rarely came into contact with any whites. But by 1968, we moved out to the suburbs. And when my parents moved us to the suburbs, they moved us to the Golden Ghetto. And that's exactly what it was called, the Golden Ghetto. Now, keep in mind, it was a 3-bedroom house. That's a quarter of the size of the house I live in now. But it was where the rich blacks of the day lived. And most of them were teachers. And when I say I had a privileged upbringing, I'm talking about just the 3 blocks that were closest to my house and what the kids I grew up with went and did. Had a Harvard MBA. We had a person who went to Harvard College who would later become executive producer for ABC News and NBC News. We had a Brown University grad, a heart surgeon, a dentist, 5 graduates of this law school, one of the law school up in Indianapolis, a West Point grad, a person who was a stockbroker for Merrill Lynch, a psychiatrist, a veterinarian, a math professor. I mean, right. This was all in the 3 blocks of kids who grew up with me. So I was in a very, very privileged upbringing. When I joined Baker & Daniels law firm after graduating from Yale Law School in 1982, I was the second person of color to work at a law firm of any significant size in the history of the state of Indiana. Indeed, when I think about being a law professor, there was a time early in my legal career where 10% of the black professors teaching law had been at Yale Law School with me. For anyone that knows anything at all about critical race theory and black scholarship over the last 20 years, I was one of the original participants in the critical race theory workshop. So Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, Angela Harris, Lonnie Guinier, all of them were there with me. I've been a law professor here now for 31 years. That means I'm the longest serving law professor of color in the history of the state of Indiana. Now, the point of all this autobiographical information is to say, when I speak about race, I know something about what I'm talking about. Because I'm not just someone who taught about race, wrote about race, but lived the experience and indeed even made some of the history. Now, I know I could deliver a dire message of doom and gloom today. And I could talk about the mighty struggles ahead. I could talk about how little progress we've made in 50 years. I could talk about the need for all of us to work harder than ever before because of the tremendous difficulty and obstacles that we face. I could do that. And that would be part of the story, but that would not be the whole story. So I'm going to concede the negatives that I could talk about in order to talk about the positives. Now, saying what I'm going to say, I'll admit, I run the risk that the audience concludes that racial struggle has progressed so well we don't need to worry about it. And that is not my intended result, but I recognize that's a risk. However, I think it is really disrespectful of all of those people who work so hard, so diligently for so many years to obtain racial equality in this society, not to acknowledge the progress that has occurred. The other thing is, I'm also showing you that your struggle for racial equality will have positive effects because it already has had positive effects. And then maybe one last point here, personal privilege, because I am an African-American law professor, so it's rare sometimes I get an opportunity to talk to black law students alone. But there's some things they need to hear, and sometimes I have to say those things in a mixed audience, understanding that if I could say it just to them, I would, but I can't, and rather than remain silent, I'm going to say it. Because you see, the black law students here are going to live as good a life as any descendants of the soil of Africa in at least the last 500 years. Part of their obligation to the black community is to role model what success is. They have to demonstrate to the community that you can be black and live an extraordinarily wonderful life in this society. And that's part of their obligation to their people. So from the perspective of 1968, we just elected Richard Hatcher mayor up in Gary and Carl Stokes mayor in Detroit. I never thought we would ever have a black president. Okay, you can say that his father was Kenyan, his mother was white, and that's what made him acceptable. I never thought we would ever have a black president, and not just elected once, elected twice. I told you about my growing up in the Golden Ghetto with the sons and daughters of teachers. So needless to say, in 1968, we didn't have black captains of major Fortune 500 corporations. Now a number of blacks have been or are heads of such corporations as Xerox, Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, AOL, Time Warner, McDonald's, Aetna. I could go on. We never paid much attention when I was a little black kid to Miss America, Miss USA pageants because black women weren't going to win them. There's so many black women that have won Miss America, Miss USA, it's not even a news story anymore. When I was in college, I interacted with the first African I had ever interacted with. I never expected there would come a time where a significant percentage of black people would voluntarily immigrate to the United States. And now 10% of the black community is foreign-born. In Indiana, up until 1965, interracial marriage was illegal. I never interacted with an interracial couple until after I graduated from law school. Now 1 in 4 blacks marries outside the race, and 1 in 8 black females marries outside of the race. Indeed, Meghan Markle is getting ready to marry into the House of Windsor and be the royal family of the United Kingdom. I never thought I would see anything like that. There were no black mixed race kids when I grew up in 1968. Due to the one-drop rule, if you had any amount of black, you were black. Now, 1 in 5 black children under the age of 11 is mixed race. I never thought that would happen. In 1968, we had almost no black policemen in the country. When we were talking about violence of the police on the black community, it was exclusively white police on the black community. The police were nothing but an occupying force. But now, not only are there a lot of blacks on police forces, but many black are police chiefs. In 1968, we never really talked about wealthy blacks. The Indiana Pacers basketball players, for example, lived in my neighborhood, as did the doctor and the lawyer. But now Oprah Winfrey's on the list of wealthiest people in the world. Blacks like Robert Johnson, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Jay-Z have amassed great fortunes. And I could go on and on and on. I could talk about the number of blacks who are presidents of predominantly white colleges and universities. I could talk about the number of deans of color. I could talk about the number of black lawyers, the number of black elected officials. I mean, the point is I could go on and on. So the really point is a simple point. Yes, America still has a long way to go, but America has a whole lot of things to be proud of when we're talking about racial progress. So with that, I want to open it up for your conversation. And this is a discussion, so I don't want to cut off anyone. If anyone wants to say something, please feel free. This is a conversation.
purposes of recording, we'd like to get it on the microphone. So if you could raise your hand, let me know.
Hi, I'm Ben. I don't know all of you, but I know a lot of you. On exactly that point that you left us with, Professor Brown, the notion of progress and how we need to recognize the progress that's been made, I think goes to a central point from the letter from Birmingham jail, which in a lot of ways was a direct response to the idea that only progress within the courts was appropriate for people of color to try to seek. That's what the message of the clergy and their call for unity that Dr. King was responding to in that letter was about. And there's some of us who have LRW will know that looking at the letter from Birmingham jail is an assignment for us this week. So in going over that, I thought about a lot of things. I had thought about the letter from Birmingham jail last December after exams because of the sheer intellectual feat of that letter. Having done that in those conditions, having recalled some of the things he did in that letter, sitting in a cell without his books at hand, the quotes that he was able to recall, the things that he was able to put together, it was astounding. But the central theme was what he called the tragic misconception of time. And I'd like to just read this one quote where he said that the tragic misconception of time is the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. We must use time creatively and forever realize that the time is always ripe to do right. To me, that is a central theme of all of Dr. King's messages, that things don't just get better. We have to make things better. We have to come together to make things better. That it doesn't just happen. And so all of those things that you mentioned are the result of efforts of individuals to try to make things better. They didn't just happen. And I think that for those of us who are here in law school and are trying to make ourselves better and make the world around us better, that is a message that we need to take to heart every day when we're doing these things, because things aren't just going to get better. We have to make them better, and we have to make sure that we use the time constructively to counteract those people of ill will who have used it. So, and that's just my thought.
Likely, I am not as eloquent as Professor Brown or Kevin here, but as I think about the I Have a Dream and just the whole movement, I grew up in the Jim Crow South. I grew up in the era of segregation. I grew up in the Jim Crow South. I grew up in the era of segregation. I grew up in rural Louisiana. We lived so far back out in the woods that our address was Rural Route 4, Box 808. Not even a street address. I am the first in my family, and that is extended family, to attend college, to earn a master's degree, and to attend law school. So to say that this country has moved from an era when desegregation did come to our area, which is Shreveport, Louisiana, which actually is, and at that time was, the second largest city in Louisiana. When desegregation did come to our area, it was tentative. It was forced upon the school board there. And how desegregation happened is that some of us were cherry picked from our class and said, we only want to send the kids who we think will be okay in what we know will be a hostile environment. And so some of us were chosen, and then our parents, in my case, my grandmother was consulted and said, okay. So we did that. Having said all that, I have made a steady journey, and so has this country. We have a lot to be proud of, but we still have a good ways to go. Thank you.
So I have three brief comments. I went to the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta this past April. I picked up a copy of an illustrated book of I Have a Dream by Kadir Nelson. It also comes with a CD of the whole speech, but if anybody's looking for something for a child, I think it's a fantastic way to carry this message through to younger generations. My second comment is I just wanted to tell Professor Brown that I found your remarks very inspiring. And then my last part is a question for Professor Lovelace. I was very intrigued by your discussion of counter narratives or changing the master narrative. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit with some specifics. What are some specific parts of the master narrative that you think need to be challenged, and what are some perspectives that you could provide that we could use to help challenge them?
Sure.
I'm wondering if the master narrative of the time in the heart of the civil rights era is any more complicated or any simpler than the master narrative today.
Yeah, I think one of the real issues is the political uses of the past, right? In the master narrative, one person becomes the savior, arguably, right, for the race, maybe even for America, right? There were other visions, even at this time, right, for racial leadership and racial change. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they rejected this leader-centered idea of civil rights leadership, right? They embraced a group-based idea, a group-centered idea of leadership. So one of the parts of the master narrative that we might challenge is this idea of a racial savior. How does this map on today? When people say, who's going to be the racial leader to take us in the next generation? Part of the problem is how we think about the past, right? That one leader didn't save us then and one leader's not going to save us now. When we think about other social movements, who's the face of the gay rights movement? No one can tell me one person, but we've seen great change if you think about over the last 2 decades. That's one of the ways. So thinking about leadership, economic rights, right? Economic rights. For Dr. King, many people say that economic justice wasn't part of the civil rights movement. It's simply about formal equality, right? Read King's Economic and Social Bill of Rights, right? Understanding King then might actually inform how we think about today, right? The structural poverty that there's not simply a glass ceiling, but there's still a sticky floor, that economic mobility hasn't happened in America, right? I'll leave you with one last point. The global nature of the civil rights movement, right? Many people think about the civil rights movement simply confined to the South, right? That King is a Georgia-born preacher, right? But King was a global thinker, right? Many others in the movement were global thinkers. This is a challenge for our law school, right? We think about our law school as a global law school, right? The challenge for many Americans is to think about the ways that ideas travel and then the travel of people itself.
I just want to add my own little take to the master narrative. I've been back and forth to India 15 times. And when I say that, a lot of people go, what are you as a black guy doing going back and forth to India 15 times if you lost your mind? But it turns out that the most oppressed people in all of human history are the untouchables of the Hindu caste system. And you're talking about 250 million people. My first meeting with them was at a soccer stadium with 80,000 untouchables together. And they had one sign over their speaker's podium: "We shall overcome." They had one speaker who spoke in English, and he said, and they called themselves Dalits. He said, "I'm a Dalit Panther. We take the name Panther from the African Americans because we see ourselves as one with their struggle." And I came to realize that the untouchables in India are inspired by the African American struggle. When I was in South Africa, I was able to learn, you take away the black civil rights struggle, and you don't have an anti-apartheid struggle. The black civil rights struggle was absolutely crucial to the creation of the struggle by blacks in South Africa. You go to Palestine. Palestine had a Black Panther Party. And indeed, Professor Lovelace's work talks about how the black civil rights struggle influenced the UN conventions against all forms of racism. So part of the narrative that needs to be changed is a recognition that this African American struggle has inspired countless of maybe billion plus people all over the world.
Hi, Professor Brown. Sorry, right here. I would like to ask you a question about something you spoke about earlier. You mentioned Black excellence and how it is our job as Black law students to live that way to evoke change. And I was wondering if there was more exactly that we should be doing, because it seems that perhaps just living successfully is not enough. And Professor Lovelace, if you have anything to add, I'd like to hear from you as well.
You know, I've been here 30 years, and so I've seen a lot of Black law students come and go. And one of the things that Black law students always fight about is whether other Black law students are doing enough to help the Black community. Believe me, you won't have to worry about helping the Black community. They will be beating a path to your door. They will be your cousins, your friends' friends. What you need to do here is to become the best lawyers, the most informed people possible, because when you leave here, you have 50 years of being in leadership in the Black community.
And I'll simply add this. Many of you wrote beautiful personal statements. Like coming into law school, right? You wanted to be Thurgood Marshall. You wanted to be Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There's only one Thurgood Marshall, there's only one Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You can be the best you possible, right? But being that change agent that you want to become, right, it means that now you have to get the tools to be that change agent. You have to take the classes that prepare you to think about social movements, to think about inequality, right? You have to study now and prepare yourself to become the very best lawyer, as Professor Brown has said. That you don't want these 3 years in law school to change you at your core, those core values, right? That passion, that purpose that you once had. Right? You've been whoever you've been for 20 plus years. Those 3 years can't co-opt you. Use this as an opportunity to become that person that you wrote about in that beautiful personal statement.
And network, get to know your colleagues. One thing about having been at this law school for 30 years, I don't have to speak with faith. I can speak with experience. There are incredibly powerful people in this room right now. As they play out over their lifetime, you have judges, you have partners at large law firms, you have people who are going to run very important not-for-profit organizations, you have all of this political power with the people here right now. Indeed, given how international this law school is, you have powerful people from all over the world. Boy, if I was anything, I would tell you to try to get to know as many people in this law school that are students as possible.
All right, so one of the things that I asked my students, I teach criminal procedure, I asked my students to do is to reflect on the criminal procedure implications of the speech. This is hard, right? Because the movement, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was about formal equality, creating formal equality, right? Not the hard stuff. And this is controversial, not the hardest stuff. So formal equality has been created. So I ask you, what is the relevance in the speech itself for the remaining struggles that we have left ahead of us? And think about criminal justice. Did you hear any of that in the speech? Anything? Anything? Anyone? Police brutality. He spoke about police brutality not once, but twice. And that's how the sort of movement now, that's what the movement now, the Black Lives Matter movement focuses on. That's what we have ahead of us. And I think it's going to be a struggle that is every bit as hard as the one that he talked about in his speech.
When I was in 7th grade, I memorized this speech, and it's been very meaningful to me ever since. So I have 2 questions, I guess, from his speech. The first is he talks about the riches of freedom. And you, Professor Brown, or richness of freedom, and Professor Brown, you talked about that a little bit now, of what has come with some freedom. I would be interested to hear what are the next things, what are the next riches of freedom. And then the other question I have has to do with the new militancy that he talks about. Because he talks about the progression to this, the peaceful protest. But what's the next evolution in the resistance, I guess? Those are my questions.
Actually, the thing that I found about life, right? There are many different generations together at one time. The world I grew up into and moved into, I have seen tremendous racial progress, absolutely no question about it. But then the younger people that come along are starting from a very different baseline. They see problems that we didn't see as problems because they weren't problems when we were dealing with them. So what I'd like to do is turn this question over to Professor Lovelace as our youngest.
One of the things, thinking about riches, to think about poverty, actually. King starts the conversation that we have for us today. The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty within this vast ocean of material prosperity. The structural nature of poverty, the stickiness of poverty, that economic mobility hasn't been, right, for this most recent generation, as much as we might have predicted or hoped for. Right? When you think about the economic turndown, the disparate impact on people of color, right, that people of color still haven't rebounded, right, from the Great Recession, one of the major issues that we have to talk about today. So in terms of thinking about riches, I would actually turn it on its head and think about poverty. The other part about this is to think about the question of inevitability. King talks about inevitability, that racial progress is not inevitable. The other part of this is to think about racial progress not being linear either, right? That there might be progress on certain fronts, but there might also be resistance. And this is American history as well. You think about slavery, right? Not much racial progress, you might argue, over time, right? What happens after slavery? Reconstruction, the number of black office holders expands. There were 2 black senators from Mississippi. How many black senators has there been from Mississippi since that time, right? But then we also see redemption in Jim Crow, the rise of the civil rights movement. But then, what do we see now? We see a president, and this is not controversial to me, right, who often talks about race relations in a way in which you would think would have been in the 1960s. Right? that this is not racial progress, that in some ways, and the analogy is right, of the White Citizens Council. I mean, that kind of bad discourse, this discourse that is not helpful for race relations. What happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, we wouldn't expect this for today. And so just to challenge the idea of even not simply inevitability, but also linear progress over time. That's what the future holds.
Also, just want to make note, we have about 30 minutes. Don't feel compelled to ask a question, but you can just give your comments and give your perspective as well. And we have a few people, so I don't want people to feel like you'd have to ask a question. You can just give your own viewpoints, how you see things. And our next person.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name's Andrew. I just wanted to give my perspective. As you know, aside from being a law student, I also have a ministerial calling. I'm a licensed minister in the Church of God in Christ. And one of the very last places that Dr. King actually spoke was at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, where he gave a speech about that how he's been to the mountaintop and seeing the future, even though he knew that most likely he wouldn't make it to see what we have today. And I would just remember in my time being in Memphis, where I was at Mason Temple and went to the podium that he leaned on and preached from, gave his last speech, was actually, in my estimate, it was a sermon, a very poetic one at that. And then going to the Lorraine Motel to see where he lost his life tragically, and just being, juxtaposed between, this birth of what the future would to hold, but at the same time, a death of a leader, of a mouthpiece that we would no longer have. And I just think for my generation is that, we've done our best to carry it on. We remember we always have Dr. King celebrations, but we forget when we work on, protests or just, civil activism or things of that nature, we forget to treat one another, love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think that as we move forth, that we have to also have compassion from our fellow man on a daily basis rather than always saying, let's fix the White House. But I think we also have to fix our house and, treat our neighbors better first, because I think that is lacking, just general compassion. And, at times I struggle with that too as a licensed minister, dealing with other people in my faith group that might not have the same skin color as I do, and seeing, we love the same Christ who was actually Jewish, not, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But, hey, in this administration, you would think different. But it's just like, where do I fit in? And, if I do leave with one last question, it would be to Professor Brown. Where does religion fit in this time frame when we come to civil rights? How do we look at it from a position of morality, from something that's higher than ourselves?
Wow, that's a hell of a question. I take religion extraordinarily seriously, right? I mean, 4 trips to Jerusalem, how many trips to sacred cities in India for Hindus, Buddhists, up on the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, Haram al-Sharif, into the place where Muhammad also ascended into heaven. I take it very seriously. As an African American, I don't go through the world as an individual. I go through the world as a member of a group. I come into life with a purpose, with a group that is struggling against its oppression, but to me, in some ways, I suppose I'd say African Americans are these incredibly powerful, strong people who in 150 years have come further than any people in human history, but they don't know it. So I have a mission already that connects me up to something higher than myself as an individual. I do think that being connected to a mission higher than yourself, you get a heck of a lot more out of life than if you think it's just about you. So I have always been respectful of those of faith, because faith helps to connect people to something that's bigger than themselves. When I was down here, I used to run the program that brought the high-achieving Black and Latinos to the undergrad here. And one of the things that really struck me was it was the ones who were deeply committed to their faith that tended to do the best. And that's because it allowed them to resist the temptations that were here. So I think religion has a critical place where its place is within the Black civil rights struggle, I think is debatable. The Black community has long had, as our leaders, ministers, and the clergy will continue to occupy a very important place. But maybe that's the best answer I can give.
There was a secular humanism within the movement. Ella Baker, her vision was to have a big tent, right? Of people who were deeply religious, but there were people who were not religious in the movement, right? When you think about the political purposes of history, if everybody is religious in the movement, right, then you can say people were good and people were bad, right? If you were a Christian, you couldn't be a communist. And so that's a way to sort of fight back. So when we remember the past, part of remembering the past is that not everybody was a Christian within the civil rights movement. But Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail is instructive to answer your specific question, right? King's letter, right, is to an interdenominational group, right? He's speaking to, right, Methodists and Baptists. He's speaking to, right, Jewish clergy. He's speaking to, right, this audience that's interfaith in nature. Remember, King had a PhD, right, in theology. And one of the lessons that you can learn from the letter from the Birmingham jail is the importance of being able, even if you're rooted in your faith, to speak across religious lines. That's what brings us together. The ability to speak to multiple audiences all at the same time, right? To be Paul in this letter from the Birmingham jail, to ask, was Jesus not an extremist for love in the letter from the Birmingham jail? But then to also know, right, Judaism, to also know, right, he's also speaking to Black Muslims in the letter from the Birmingham jail. So being able to speak across religious lines remains important for us today.
I wondered, as a strategy going forward, not that it seems very practical with this particular administration, how important is a formal apology from the U.S. government for slavery, and how important would reparations to the African American community be?
Reparations would be hugely beneficial, even if they weren't directed to individuals, but they were directed to community organizations that would fight things like mass incarceration or the terrible, terrible problems that we have with urban education. People may have a different view on this. I don't personally think an apology for slavery would mean very much. God, I could imagine Trump giving such an apology. And I don't think it would mean much because I don't think there would be anything behind it. But don't get me wrong, I don't think there's any way our Supreme Court is currently constituted would ever allow any significant reparations. It would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment that was added to the Constitution in 1868 for the purpose of protecting the rights of the freedmen.
So I don't have my thoughts fully fleshed out yet, but they are related to what we just spoke about in terms of reparations. I wanted us to consider and challenge the notion that progress is defined by exceptionalism. So while I love the fact that there are Black lawyers and Black CEOs and people in prominent positions who look like me, I think it's important also to understand that that isn't what defines progress in general. In the 1950s, there were poor white people who didn't experience racism. So those positions themselves aren't, while they're part of our idea of what progress is, I think for a lot of African Americans and for me as a Ghanaian American, we define the worth of people sometimes by the positions that they achieve or the places that they get to that their parents couldn't get. So I think that if we flesh out the idea of what our next goals are for the next lap, what types of things are we trying to achieve in addition to more people of color operating in higher positions than before?
So I have a question. I think I'll direct this. Sorry to pepper you with so many questions, but I think I'll direct this to Professor Lovelace. Thinking about
the period of history that we're in now, not just in terms of civil rights, in terms of race relations, but in terms of technology, in terms of mass production and things of that nature, and thinking about Dr. King's methodology of nonviolence, and where so many things now are mass produced, demonstrations, movements, people are, Twitter activists now, Slacktivists, I think they're called, where you can protest on Twitter at the drop of a keyboard. How effective or how relevant when we can see videos of police brutality now mass produced so quickly and spread in a day, and from one day to the next you see another one. How effective, and I don't condone violence, but how effective is a methodology of nonviolence, and considering the different narratives, different approaches that other leaders have held that weren't necessarily a nonviolent approach?
So 2 questions. First, about media. I think that media is incredibly important, right? So the things that you pointed out, right? Being able to share a video of police brutality. On one hand, it does new damage to our souls to continue to watch those kinds of things. On another hand, right, just getting the word out, right, that police brutality is rampant in the United States. But this question of media, of new media, is not a new question. TV, 1950s and 60s, right? New media, right? The UPI, right? And the AP, their news wires are crisscrossing the world for the first time in the 1950s and 60s. That was new media, that TV, right? And that widespread newspapers, right? Part of new media. Dr. King used that masterfully, right? Think about Selma, right? Think about Selma, right? You can watch Bloody Sunday, that there's a confrontation, and this was King's idea, right? Time and time again, right? In Birmingham, right? That there would be nonviolent protesters, right? Who would come against this force, right? Against them of white supremacy, right? This clash would be dramatized, and then the souls, the consciences of people all around the world, right, would be stirred, and that this would drive change, right? So this question of media is an important one that we can go back to history and say that new media can be a tool, right, and should be a tool in a social movement repertoire. Now, it can't be a substitute for day-to-day activism. That people need to connect, that people need to knock on doors, that people need to register voters, right? That people need to do the sort of slow but respectful work of organizing, right? Not simply a one-day march, but what do you do between marches, right? This is the brilliance of the movement. How did Black Lives Matter proliferate? People are doing this kind of work between, right, the large marches. And so using media as a tool is important, right? It supports the movement, but it can't supplant, right, the organizing that's the lifeblood of the movement. Nonviolence itself. I believe in nonviolence, right? I believe in nonviolence. The power of nonviolence has not only been demonstrated in the United States, but how did Gandhi overcome, right, the British Empire? How did Kwame Nkrumah overcome, right, the British Empire? When the odds and the stakes, right, are just completely different. If every black person had a gun, right, and began to shoot up the world, God forbid, right? But not enough military power to do that, right? So it's not practical on another level, but morally, going to this question of religion, going to this question of even secular humanism, I believe strongly in nonviolence. You know, the change that we've seen in the gay rights movement, as we've seen in Black Lives Matter, right? The power of nonviolence has been demonstrated time and time again.
Going back to what Zoe said about getting to a certain position and feeling like we've made it, per se, I think the biggest thing for me is not actually getting there, but having the ability to get there. Not having those roadblocks that are, stopping us from reaching where we want to go. I think that's what, for me, listening to King's speech, it's more about, when he talks about the freedom, it's the freedom to get somewhere. It's the freedom to become a black professor, a black lawyer. Those are the freedoms that, those are what we signify as having the freedom and making it in a way, because you don't have to be a millionaire or whatever like that. But the fact that you can still get there, we look up to people like Professor Brown, Professor Lovelace, and seeing that it's possible. Being a black professor is possible. Being an educated black man in this society that we're in is possible. Being a CEO, things like that. For me, that's the freedom that I'm looking up to. Just knowing that those roadblocks will no longer be there and that I can attain these certain positions.
So I'm going to direct my question towards Professor Brown, kind of on two counts. One, because of your time here at Maurer, and two, because of some of the comments you made Friday during Professor Sanders' talk about the discussion around using color blindness and things like that. So last year there was a moment in this room, I believe it was the moot court finals, but a moment was taken to draw attention to the fact that the leadership positions of the moot court board and the three major journals were all represented by persons of color. So my question to you is, one, more of the framing and the lenses at which we look at those discussions of progress. Is that something that you think is more helpful drawing that attention to and celebrating that, even though it took until 2017? Or is that something that should maybe be pushed forward as there shouldn't be something remarkable about, a person of color in a leadership position, and that it was just a coincidence of circumstance that it took that long for all four to coalesce into one? So I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Well, no, I definitely think that we should celebrate those kind of accomplishments. The thing about colorblindness came into being at a point in time where the assumption was that if you were black, by definition, you were inferior. By definition, you were stigmatized. So to say to someone, we're not going to recognize your race, was to say, we're not going to recognize you as inferior. I am not inferior. And when I look at African American people, I look at African American people from the standpoint of what they have accomplished, which is really extraordinary. I say this all the time. I say, look, if you think about powerful sons and daughters of Africa, we are the most powerful in at least the last 500 years. And indeed, I would say there'd be a debate as to whether or not the ancient Egyptians were more powerful than African Americans. Our messages go global. Every corner of the world that I have been to, and I've been to quite a few, indeed, just to give you one example, when I was in Mongolia, we saw a Mongolian rap group, right? Picking off from rappers here in black rappers in the United States. African Americans have this incredible power, but our society doesn't talk about it. Our society doesn't talk about it. So for me, what's important isn't to ignore my race, but to rather to say, hey, look, being black in America, you probably see a different reality than I do being white in America. I'd be really interested in the kind of reality that you see. In other words, I don't want my reality effaced by someone saying, oh, I'm not going to mention the fact that you're black. Hey, I've been black all my life. I don't mind people going, well, you're the black guy. And I don't mind people coming up to me and going, oh, well, what do African Americans think about this? I mean, indeed, I think, yeah, I have an obligation to say, well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you. So I think the problem with colorblindness is it paints you in a box where if you want to actually talk about race, you feel like a racist. And what I'm trying to get to is a situation where we can appreciate race, where we can have conversations about it. We can say, well, I would never have thought about that. Like, just as an example, I suspect every black law student here knew how many black professors there were within the first week of school. So I think colorblindness is like the effacement of the whole reality that people of color live with.
So I really appreciate Professor Brown, you starting with the fact that you could emphasize the progress, which you did, I think, in a very inspiring way, or the pit we're in, you know, and I find it a depressing time, and I really appreciate you and then Provost Lauren Nobel this morning at the breakfast talking about when she was growing up and I was growing up. It's the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon was president, and we thought democracy was dead, you know, and so that is really important to hear. I also, though, appreciate Professor Lovelace talking about the stickiness of poverty and the comment from a woman over here about not focusing only on exceptionalism. So I want to just share a couple of figures that seem appropriate to me. So I'm currently working on and the point of reparations made me think about something advocating that we tax wealth, not just income in this country. That is important for many reasons, including, well, the horrible economic inequality, but that is not going, that the disparate impact based on race is not going to be addressed meaningfully if we just focus on income rather than wealth. And so this, I just think is, I've been startled by the figures. So two things. 9% of white households have zero net worth or less. 9% for African American households, 27%. Median black wealth, 11,000. Median white wealth, how many times more do you think it is? 12 times, 134,000. You know, so far, far more egregious than talking about income. So I just want to put a plug out there for a wealth tax on race and other grounds. And you know, very depressing. And last thing I'll say is, I find, you know, in this time, just to not be be more of a downer. You know, things like Citizens United, wealth in politics, and gerrymandering, I think, are major obstacles as well to achieving greater equality.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. So, again, unfortunately, we've come to that time when it's getting good. We have to come to a close. But before I do so, I just want to take this time to acknowledge, first of all, I want to thank again Dean Austin for being here, Parrish, for all the faculty, staff. Missed earlier, I didn't acknowledge Judge Hamilton in the building. Of course, we want to acknowledge Mayor Hamilton that's also here with us today. If you would just put your hands together for Mayor Hamilton being in the building. I wanted to take this opportunity also to extend, and getting this together was just kind of quick or whatever. I want to acknowledge Professor Bell also. If you wanted to have some additional words to say, whatever, we certainly appreciate everything. Professor Bell, I want to give you an opportunity. Professor Fuentes Roar.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. Wonderful. It was really thoughtful, and thank you.
Professor Cantanilla is back. I saw Professor Ornstein. Well, thank you. Well, listen, I just want to just give everyone an opportunity. I'm sorry, Professor Dowsey. I'm sorry. On this side, would you? Please. Thank you.
And I would like to add that being from Belgium, that the civil rights movement is extremely well taught in history classes from early age onwards, and that it has been inspiring. We deal with racism in lots of countries in West Europe, that it has been inspiring a lot of movements in the 60s and also later when I grew up
you.
This is wonderful to hear and watch the
Professor Nahee? And I just want to, right before I close out, I just want to give an opportunity for one of the presidents being in the building. I want to leave opportunity for President of the BLSA to come down. Devin Brown, would you like to come and have any words?
I'll just speak from here. I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you, professors. Thank you, dean parents. And most of all, thank you, Kevin, for spearheading this.
Well, before we close, as one of the youngest members of this class body, I'm really excited to be here, to be a part of such an amazing group of brilliant legal scholars, to be, and will go on to do great things. And I think about why I'm here, and more importantly, as we watch this video of Dr. King in 1963, I'm reminded that it's through the struggles, through the work of Dr. King and all those individuals of the civil rights movement that affords us the opportunity to sit in the place that we are today, to study law and to change the law and to continue the work that was started during the civil rights movement. That is a responsibility that we hold, being here, the work to carry this work forward. And I'm going to leave you with this, one of his wonderful quotes that I love: the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in the moment of comfort and convenience, but the ultimate measure of a man is where he stands in the moment of challenge and controversy. If you want to know your measure, just look where you stand. Thank you all for coming.